Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into, well, one of the most transformative periods in American history, the Great Depression, and the massive experimental response known as the New Deal.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine the scene around 1932. The scale of the crisis was just truly staggering.
It's hard to overstate it, really.
Oh, yeah.
The material we're looking at paints this picture of just widespread despair. Banks were collapsing everywhere.
Right.
People were losing their farms, their homes, unemployment had hit levels that, honestly, we can barely even fathom today. The country was hurting profoundly.
Right. A nation really brought to its knees. And our mission in this deep dive, using the material you've shared, is to, cut through all the complexity and get to the core of this era. We want to pull out the key insights, understand these ambitious programs they rolled out, and explore the different viewpoints on whether this unprecedented effort actually, well, worked. How did America respond when faced with its worst economic crisis ever? And what lasting mark did that response leave?
Absolutely. And we'll navigate through this information together, highlighting the crucial turning points, showing you how different pieces fit together.
Yeah.
And helping you understand not just what happened, but why it mattered then and, frankly, why it still matters now.
At the very heart of this whole story is Franklin D. Roosevelt. And it's fascinating to see, based on the material, that he came from a world away from the suffering he would eventually address. Born into privilege, right? Hyde Park, New York, wealth, comfort.
Yes, quite a contrast. His early political life saw him involved as Undersecretary of the Navy during World War I. He was even a vice presidential nominee in 1920, though on a losing ticket. He was definitely part of the establishment.
But then came that pivotal moment in 1921. The material points to his being struck by polio, which left him unable to walk.
Yeah.
This personal struggle, it suggests, wasn't just a physical challenge, but one that profoundly shaped his character. It deepened his resolve, his patience, tolerance, maybe even his compassion.
That personal adversity seems to have been a real crucible for the leader he became. Before the presidency, he served as governor of New York starting in 1928.
Right.
And in that role, he began implementing programs in response to the Depression, aid for the jobless, public works, help for farmers, conservation efforts. Yeah. These state-level things really started to catch national attention.
And the reaction to these programs was, well, intense. Some of the wealthy, seeing his focus on government intervention, actually labeled him a traitor to his class. Yet he was frequently talking about his concern for the forgotten man.
His political style is described as, suave, conciliatory, and he was undoubtedly one of the greatest public speakers of his generation.
Definitely.
But there's a layer of complexity the material highlights. Despite this image of a big spending reformer, in many ways he was fiscally pretty cautious. And not fundamentally opposed to big business either.
Interesting.
Yeah, it suggests an underlying conservatism sort of woven into his progressive actions.
And you absolutely cannot discuss FDR during this period without talking about Eleanor Roosevelt. Her importance is really emphasized. Theodore Roosevelt's niece, a prominent figure herself.
Oh, hugely important.
And she was relentless in pushing FDR's career, campaigning tirelessly for him.
She truly evolved into the moral compass of the New Deal. Through her syndicated column and just constant lobbying, she championed causes that were sometimes overlooked, particularly for women, children, the impoverished, and African Americans.
Yeah.
The material calls her the most active first lady the country had seen up to that point.
So with the nation in crisis and the stage set, the 1932 election became a massive turning point. It was Roosevelt for the Democrats against the incumbent Herbert Hoover.
Right. And Roosevelt's campaign gave us that enduring phrase, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
Famous words.
Very. What's interesting, though, is how the material describes his campaign promises as, well, surprisingly vague and even contradictory at times.
Contradictory? How so?
Well, at different points, he promised to balance the budget and slash government spending, even criticized Hoover for deficits.
Right.
But, simultaneously, he was pledging significant government aid for the unemployed and pushing for things like repealing prohibition. It wasn't exactly a neatly packaged, consistent economic plan he presented.
Meanwhile, Hoover was advocating for more traditional Republican policies, higher tariffs, sticking to the gold standard. He predicted disaster if the Hawley-Smoot tariff was repealed,
right,
and really reaffirmed his belief in free enterprise and individual self-reliance.
His tone, though, compared to Roosevelt's optimism, was often seen as defensive, kind of struggling to connect with a public that was just deeply disillusioned.
And the result was a seismic shift. Roosevelt won in a landslide, 472 electoral votes to just 59 for Hoover, swept almost the entire country.
Yeah, a huge win. The popular vote difference was significant, too.
And a crucial detail highlighted here is the movement of black voters.
Oh, absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Traditionally loyal to the Republican Party since the Civil War, this election marked a major shift towards the Democrats.
Right.
They became a really vital part of this new Democratic coalition that would, well, last for decades.
Then came that awkward lame duck period between the election in November and the inauguration, which was back in March then.
Yeah, how long?
The material describes Hoover trying to sort of tie Roosevelt's hands, pushing for anti-inflationary policies that could have, strangled future New Deal initiatives.
Right, trying to lock him in. Roosevelt, understandably, refused to play along or endorse Hoover's ideas.
And this standoff happened while the economy was just seizing up, coming to a virtual halt in those final months of Hoover's term. It must have been a period of intense uncertainty.
Definitely. And interestingly, some important constitutional changes were also underway around then.
Right. Congress passed the 21st Amendment early in 33, which would eventually repeal prohibition by the end of that year.
Yep. End of an era there.
And the 20th Amendment, moving the inauguration date from March up to January, was also adopted. FDR would be the first president to take office on the new January 20th date, but not until 1937 for his second term.
All this just reinforces the desperate situation demanding immediate action when FDR finally took office. I mean, the reality on the ground in 1932 was just stark. Unemployment numbers, maybe a quarter, maybe even a third of the workforce had no job.
Just imagine that, a third of the workforce. And the financial system was just crumbling. About a quarter of all banks had failed by 1933.
Yeah, the material gives specific numbers.
Yeah.
Over 10,000 bank failures in total by then, with, get this, over 5,000 failing in 1933 alone.
Wow. In 1 year.
And it wasn't just the cities. On the farms, a quarter of farmers had lost their land. Businesses were shutting down everywhere.
Beyond the numbers, the human toll was immense. The material mentions the loss of self-worth among millions of Americans. That feeling of failure, that intangible cost. Devastating.
That was the landscape when FDR delivered his inaugural address, offering that famous line. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Powerful words.
A real call to action, and maybe even more importantly, a psychological lift for the nation.
His approach was certainly unconventional for the time. The material mentions his reliance on a brain trust, this group of experts he assembled, often academics, not just the usual politicians or business leaders.
Right. Figures like Frances Perkins, the first woman in a cabinet position as Secretary of Labor, and Harry Hopkins, who had head key relief programs, they were part of this new guard.
And the period immediately after his inauguration is famously known as the 100 Days.
Yeah, March to June 1933. Congress passed just an unprecedented amount of legislation. But the material makes it clear FDR wasn't working from some detailed blueprint.
No, the approach was much more experimental, kind of a let's try things and see what works philosophy, focused on practical solutions to practical problems.
Which meant some programs might overlap or even seem contradictory, right? But the urgency just demanded action. Do something.
And a key tool in rallying the nation and explaining these actions directly to the people was his use of fireside chats over the radio.
Brilliant communication strategy.
Yeah.
Really connected with people.
The overall strategy is often summed up by those 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform.
That's the framework. The immediate focus, the short-range goals, were getting relief to those suffering and trying to kickstart immediate recovery.
Just stop the bleeding.
Exactly. The longer-term vision was permanent recovery and fundamental reform, trying to prevent such a crisis from happening again. And the material points to ideas that were considered pretty progressive for the time.
Like?
Well, things like unemployment insurance, old age pensions, minimum wage, conservation efforts, curbing child labor, stuff we take more for granted now, but radical then.
And Congress, energized by FDR's huge mandate and the national emergency, was incredibly cooperative at first.
Yeah, they essentially gave the president extraordinary blank check powers, sometimes even delegating legislative authority to the executive just to act quickly. This period truly left a deep legislative mark on the country.
And it's helpful, as you said, to think of the New Deal in 2 phases. The initial burst from 33 to 35 is often called the first New Deal,
Right.
followed by the second New Deal from 35 to 38, which often involve maybe more far-reaching reforms.
That's a good way to structure it. And one of the first and most critical problems they had to tackle was the banking crisis. We mentioned the sheer number of failures, over 5,033 alone. banks closed in most states.
Total panic.
Complete panic. So FDR's immediate response was bold. He declared a national banking holiday. Just closed all the banks for several days in March 1933.
Just shut it all down.
Yeah. The idea was to stop the panic, allow inspectors in, and only let sound, solvent banks reopen, trying to restore public confidence.
And right alongside that, he took another major step, moving the nation off the gold standard. March 6, 1933.
This was huge. I mean, really fundamental. It meant people had to turn in their private gold holdings for paper money. Congress canceled the requirement to pay debts in gold, effectively moving to what they called a managed currency.
What was the goal there?
The goal, as Material explains, was to devalue the dollar somewhat. They did this in 1934, setting the gold price at $35 an ounce, which is about 59% of its former value. This controlled inflation was intended to stimulate the economy, particularly exports, and they forbade exporting gold.
Then on March 9th, the Emergency Banking Relief Act sort of formalized all this, giving FDR the power to manage the reopening of banks, provide funds, and prevent gold hoarding.
And this is where those fireside chats became so incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
In his very first chat on March 12th, heard by millions, FDR just explained in simple terms what they were doing.
Yeah.
He assured people it was now safer to put their money back in the reopened banks than keep it hidden under the mattress.
And it worked.
It worked dramatically. Deposits surged back into the banks. Confidence was maybe not fully restored overnight, but significantly boosted. People believed him.
Beyond the banks themselves, they also had to tackle the crisis facing homeowners, right? Mass foreclosures.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, was created in June 1933.
What did it do?
This organization refinanced mortgages for roughly 1 million non-farm homes. 1 million. It prevented mass foreclosures, which not only helped families stay in their homes, but also, crucially, bailed out many banks that held those bad mortgages.
Ah, so it helped both sides.
Exactly. And the material suggests this program was really key in shifting middle-class loyalty toward the Democrats. People remembered who helped them keep their homes.
And then a truly foundational reform for the financial system was the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, also in June 33.
Foundational is the right word.
The absolute key takeaway from Glass-Steagall, thing most people still know today, the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC.
Exactly. That's the big one. This federally insured individual bank deposits, initially up to $5,000.
Which doesn't sound like much now, but was a lot then.
Oh, absolutely. It meant your money in the bank was safe, even if the bank failed. That was revolutionary for public confidence. And the act also did something else important. It separated commercial banking, taking deposits, and making loans from investment banking, which deals in stocks and bonds.
Why was that significant?
The idea was to prevent banks from using depositors' money for risky speculation in the stock market, which many believed had contributed to the crash. Keep the everyday banking safe.
Okay, so moving beyond banks, the New Deal brought more regulation to finance and industry too. The Truth and Securities Act in May 33.
Right, that required companies selling stocks and bonds to actually provide accurate information about their value and risks. No more hiding the ball.
And to enforce that, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, was established in June 1934.
Yep. Its job was, and still is, to protect investors from fraud, deception, manipulation, aiming for a more transparent and efficient stock market.
Later on, as part of the second New Deal in 35, the Public Utility Holding Company Act came in. What was that about?
That limited the ability of big utility companies to build these vast, complex corporate empires with minimal capital. It gave the SEC power to regulate them more tightly, break up some of the biggest ones.
And the Banking Act of 1935.
That strengthened the Federal Reserve System, creating a more powerful central board of governors with broader authority over monetary policy, trying to prevent future financial instability from the top down.
Okay, let's shift gears to unemployment. Addressing the millions out of work was a massive undertaking. The first New Deal rolled out several key programs for relief and work. Maybe the most popular was the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, created March 33.
Oh yeah, the CCC was incredibly popular. This put nearly 3 million young men, mostly aged 18 to 24, to work in government camps, often out in rural areas.
Doing what kind of work?
Conservation projects mainly, planting trees, millions of them fighting wildfires, controlling floods, developing national parks. They lived a structured, sort of quasi-military life run by the War Department.
The material notes some criticism concerns about it being too militaristic or some immigrant fears.
There were some criticisms, yeah, but also a key positive feature. Most of their pay, which wasn't huge but was steady, was sent directly home to their families. So it helped support families back home, too.
Then there was the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FARA, headed by Harry Hopkins.
Right. FARA provided about $3 billion to states. The states could use it either for direct cash payments, the dole, or for work projects.
Then Hopkins had a preference.
Yes, the material notes that Hopkins himself came to prefer work relief. He felt that just giving people handouts could, harm their self-respect. Better to give them a job, even if temporary.
Out of FARA came the Civil Works Administration, the CWA, a shorter-lived program, late 33 to early 34.
Yeah, the CWA directly hired about 4 million unemployed people. It got money into people's hands very quickly, which was the goal.
But it faced criticism.
It did. It was widely criticized for creating make-work jobs, sometimes dismissively called boondoggling things like raking leaves or repairing minor roads. Didn't seem like real work to some. It was terminated fairly quickly in April 34.
Another significant program for public works was the Public Works Administration, the PWA, created under the NIRA in 33, led by Harold L. Ikes.
Right. Now, the PWA had a huge budget, over $4 billion, and it was focused on building large, durable infrastructure projects, things like schools, dams, post offices, highways, bridges. The Grand Coulee Dam was a PWA project.
Impressive stuff, but there was criticism here, too.
Yeah, the main criticism of Ikes and the PWA was that he was very cautious, very meticulous about approving projects, maybe too cautious. Meaning he spent the money too slowly. While the projects were valuable long-term, it didn't provide jobs fast enough to meet the immediate crisis. Millions remained jobless while the PWA geared up. That experience definitely influenced later work programs like the WPA.
Okay, let's turn to the farmers. The farming sector was also facing total collapse. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA, was created in May 1933. What was the core idea?
The fundamental idea behind the AAA was pretty simple economics, actually. Reduce supply to raise prices. They wanted farm prices to get back to the levels they were in the more prosperous pre-World War I years, 1909, 1914.
How'd they do that?
Basically, the government paid farmers subsidies to not plant crops on part of their land or to reduce their livestock herds, take land out of production.
And where did the money for the subsidies come from?
It came from a tax on companies that processed farm products, like flour mills or meat packers. That funding mechanism, though, was later ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court.
Some of the actions taken under the AAA were incredibly controversial, weren't they? Especially when people were going hungry.
Oh, absolutely. The material points to things like plowing under acres of cotton that were already growing or slaughtering millions of young pigs.
Destroying food.
Yeah. Now, some of the meat was distributed for relief or used as fertilizer, and there was an economic logic trying to break the cycle of overproduction and crashing prices. But the imagery, the idea of destroying food while people starved, it was powerful and drew a lot of criticism.
What was the impact on people on the ground, particularly those who didn't own the land they worked, like tenant farmers or sharecroppers?
This is a really critical point and a major downside. While overall farm income did rise, which was the goal, tenant farmers and sharecroppers were often hurt badly.
How so?
Well, when landowners got paid subsidies to take land out of cultivation, they often just kicked the tenants or sharecroppers off that land. The owner kept the subsidy payment, and the worker lost their livelihood. It increased rural poverty for many.
And like other early programs, the AAA faced a Supreme Court challenge.
It did. It was struck down in the Butler versus U.S. case. Roosevelt's response, according to the material, was basically to find workarounds, creating smaller programs in the states, shifting the funding mechanism to continue the farm support policies.
Were there other measures to help farmers?
Yes. Things like the Commodity Credit Corporation, which offered loans, allowing farmers to store their crops and wait for better prices, kind of like the old populist idea of a sub-treasury plan. And the Federal Farm Loan Act consolidated various farm credit programs and provided funds to help farmers facing foreclosure.
And looming over this whole agricultural crisis was the environmental catastrophe of the Dust Bowl.
Yeah, a truly devastating event.
Yeah.
Starting in the Great Plains around late 1933, caused by severe drought, combined with decades of unsustainable farming practices that had destroyed the topsoil.
Just blew away.
Literally blew away in massive dust storms, destroyed farms, livelihoods. This led to that iconic migration of hundreds of thousands of displaced families, the Okies and Arkies fleeing west, mostly towards California, looking for work.
Did the New Deal try to respond to this specific crisis?
It did. The Fraser-Lemke Farm Bankruptcy Act helped farmers defer foreclosures and maybe recover lost land. The Resettlement Administration, though controversial itself, aimed to move destitute families to better land or set up cooperative farms.
And conservation efforts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The CCC played a vital role here, planting over 200 million trees to create shelter belts, trying to hold the soil down. And the material points to John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, as being absolutely instrumental in educating the wider public about the human tragedy of the Dust Bowl migrants.
Such a powerful book.
Made a huge impact.
Now, a truly transformative program for rural areas you mentioned was the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA, part of the Second New Deal in 1935.
Yes, this was huge for quality of life in the countryside. Before the REA, most rural areas simply didn't have electricity.
Why not?
Because private utility companies didn't see it as profitable to run power lines out to sparsely populated farms in small towns. Just wasn't worth the investment for them.
So the REA stepped in.
Exactly. The REA provided low-interest loans and, importantly, WPA labor to help local farmer cooperatives build their own power lines and distribution systems. It brought electricity, lights, radios, appliances to millions of rural homes for the first time. A massive change.
Okay, let's turn to industry and labor. One of the most ambitious and maybe complex programs was the National Industrial Recovery Administration, the NIRA, June 1933.
Yes, the NIRA was incredibly ambitious. The core idea here was to try and stabilize the entire industrial economy, to prevent what they saw as destructive, excessive competition, labor disputes, and chronic overproduction.
How did they think they could achieve that?
There was a belief, noted in the material, which later proved kind of wrong, but was influential then, that the U.S. economy had sort of reached its growth limit, and that pure laissez-faire competition was actually harmful now.
So what did the NIRA actually do?
It involved industry leaders and labor representatives working together industry by industry to create codes of fair competition.
Codes, like rules.
Exactly. These codes set industry-wide rules for things like maximum hours people could work, minimum wages they had to be paid, sometimes even minimum prices for products, and production limits or quotas. To allow this kind of cooperation, antitrust laws were temporarily suspended.
Who benefited most from these codes?
Well, that was a point of criticism. Some critics on the left felt the codes often favored the larger corporations because their representatives often dominated the code writing process.
A key part for workers, though, was Section 7A.
Yes, Section 7A was a landmark provision within the NIRA. It formally recognized and protected workers' right to organize unions and bargain collectively with their employers.
That's a big deal.
Huge. It also outlawed yellow dog contracts, which were agreements where workers had to promise not to join a union as a condition of getting hired.
And the agency running all this was the NRA.
Right, the National Recovery Administration, led by the colorful Hugh Johnson. Its job was to implement and promote the NIRA codes. That's where the famous Blue Eagle symbol came from, with the slogan, "We do our part." Businesses displayed it to show they complied with the codes.
How successful was the NRA?
The results were mixed. It did provide a short-term boost to business activity and morale, but it struggled to effectively help smaller businesses, got bogged down in bureaucracy, and faced growing criticism from both business and labor. Ultimately, it was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1935.
That was the famous Schechter poultry case, the sick chicken case.
That's the one. The court ruled unanimously that Congress had improperly delegated its legislative power to these industry code boards, and also that the federal government's power over interstate commerce didn't extend to regulating a local Brooklyn chicken business.
Did that kill the New Deal's efforts in industry?
Not entirely. The material suggests that the ruling, while a blow, might have actually let FDR gracefully discard a program that was already facing significant problems and conveniently blame the court for its demise.
And the crucial labor protections from Section 7A, did they disappear?
No, thankfully for labor, they were later reestablished and actually strengthened by the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act, in 1935. This was a cornerstone of the Second New Deal.
Tell us more about the Wagner Act.
This was a major victory for labor unions. It explicitly protected the right to organize, to bargain collectively through chosen representatives, and it created the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, to oversee union elections and investigate unfair labor practices by employers.
So it really put teeth into labor rights.
Absolutely. It spurred tremendous growth in union membership, especially in the new CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, led by John L. Lewis. The CIO focused on organizing unskilled workers in mass production industries like auto and steel.
The material mentions the 1936 sit-down strike at GM.
Yes, a pivotal event. Workers in Flint, Michigan, occupied the General Motors plant for weeks. It was a risky tactic, but it worked. GM eventually recognized the CIO union. After this, labor became a much more powerful political force and a very strong ally of the Democratic Party.
The last major piece of labor legislation from the New Deal era was the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938.
Right, sometimes called the Wages and Hours Bill. This finally established a federal minimum wage started at 25 cents an hour and set a maximum 40-hour work week for most industries involved in interstate commerce.
40-hour week, wow.
Yeah, huge change. It also prohibited oppressive child labor for kids under 16 and restricted dangerous jobs for those under 18, really foundational labor standards.
Okay, another really ambitious program from the first New Deal was the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, May 1933, described as the first major attempt at regional public planning.
Yes, the TVA was unique. The idea was to revitalize the entire Tennessee River Valley region, which was one of the poorest areas in the country plagued by flooding, soil erosion, lack of electricity, and poverty.
How did it plan to do that?
The TVA, set up as a public corporation, embarked on a massive program of building dams, over 20 of them eventually. These dams served multiple purposes: controlling the devastating floods in the Tennessee River,
Critical.
improving river navigation, preventing soil erosion through reforestation and better farming practices, and, crucially, generating hydroelectric power.
So, public power.
Yes. A key goal was to establish a yardstick, a benchmark for the actual cost of generating and distributing electricity, hoping to demonstrate that private power companies were overcharging customers. They wanted to drive down electricity rates across the board.
Was the TVA successful?
By most measures, yes, incredibly successful. The material highlights its achievements, providing thousands of much-needed jobs in a region with very high unemployment, bringing cheap electricity to countless homes and farms for the first time,
Game changer.
restoring depleted soil, reforesting vast areas, controlling floods, improving navigation. It really did transform the valley's economy and environment.
But it must have drawn criticism.
Oh, absolutely. Private power companies fought it tooth and nail, seeing it as unfair government competition. Critics slammed it as socialistic, an example of government control and a dangerous experiment in a planned economy. Congress actually refused to authorize similar regional authorities elsewhere.
Housing reform was also tackled. The Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, created in 1934.
Right. The FHA aimed to stimulate the very depressed construction industry. It didn't build houses itself, but it provided federal insurance on long-term, low-down payment mortgages issued by private banks.
Making it easier to get a mortgage.
Much easier and less risky for the banks. This encouraged home building and home ownership. And the bureau points out, interestingly, that the FHA is one of the few alphabet agencies from the New Deal that still exists and operates today.
And the United States Housing Authority, the USHA, in 1937, that was different.
Yes, the USHA focused specifically on low-cost public housing. It lent money to state and local housing agencies to actually build housing projects for low-income families.
What was its impact?
The material notes, it was the first time in about a century that slum growth in the U.S. actually slowed down or even reversed in some areas, so it made a dent. However, it also faced strong criticism from real estate interests, landlords, anti-New Dealers who saw it as wasteful or socialistic, and it ultimately fell short of its very ambitious housing goals.
Now, arguably the most enduring and maybe the most far-reaching piece of legislation from this whole era, according to the material, is the Social Security Act of 1935.
Without a doubt. Passed in August 35, a key part of the Second New Deal. It was incredibly complex and truly transformative. It was partly inspired by similar social insurance programs in Europe, but also by domestic pressure from reformers and critics like Townsend and Long.
What were its main components? What did it actually do?
It established several key programs. First, a federal-state system of unemployment insurance providing temporary income if you lost your job through no fault of your own.
Okay.
Second, and most famously, it created a national system of old-age pensions for retired workers, funded by a payroll tax paid by both employers and employees.
The Social Security we know today.
A foundation of it, yes. Third, it provided federal funds to states to help them give financial assistance to dependent mothers and children, as well as aid for the blind and later the disabled.
So, a real safety net.
A comprehensive safety net, yes. By 1939, millions were covered, with the first retirement benefits starting to be paid out in 1942, providing a basic income floor for retirees.
What was the reaction?
Well, conservatives at the time criticized it pretty heavily. They viewed it as discouraging work and individual initiative, promoting dependency on the government. But it quickly became incredibly popular with the public.
The Second New Deal also saw changes to the tax system, the Revenue Act of 1935.
Yes, sometimes called the Wealth Tax Act. It significantly increased income taxes on the highest earners and also raised taxes on inheritances, large gifts, and capital gains. It essentially rolled back many of the tax cuts for the wealthy that had been implemented in the 1920s.
And a significant shift occurred for Native Americans with the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934.
Right. This was championed by John Collier, who was the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It marked a major reversal of previous federal policy. It repealed the Dawes Act of 1887, which had sought to break up tribal lands and force assimilation.
So what did the 1934 Act do instead?
It aimed to restore tribal self-governance, encouraging tribes to write constitutions and form tribal councils. It restored tribal ownership of lands, provided loans for economic development, and importantly, ended federal laws that had forbidden Native American religious ceremonies, traditional dress, and languages.
A major change in philosophy.
Huge. The material also notes it helped Native Americans gain access to other New Deal programs, like the CCC and WPA as well.
So, stepping back a bit, by 1935, after this first wave of programs, what was the overall impact on the economy? Was the Depression over?
Definitely not over, but the material indicates there was clear improvement. The gross national product had risen substantially from its lowest point. Manufacturing wages and especially farm income had increased significantly. The money supply was growing again.
But the big problem remained unemployment.
Yes. Despite those positive signs, unemployment remained stubbornly high. It had dropped from the absolute peak, maybe 25 or 30%, but it was still hovering around 20% of the non-farm workforce in 1935.
Still incredibly high.
Still millions and millions of people looking for jobs, vastly higher than the pre-depression rate of around 3%.
Okay.
So recovery was underway, but far from complete.
Now, a program, or rather a whole set of programs, as sweeping and transformative as the New Deal, was bound to face strong opposition, right?
Oh, absolutely. Fierce opposition.
The material details various voices of criticism, and it's important, as you said, to understand where they were coming from, reflecting the really sharp divisions of the time.
Definitely. One organized group was the American Liberty League, founded in 1934. This is made up mostly of wealthy businessmen, some prominent Republicans, and also some conservative Democrats like Al Smith, who had run against Hoover in 28.
What was their argument?
They saw the New Deal as dangerously socialistic, undermining American liberty. They defended the principles of free enterprise, private property, and the open shop, meaning employment without mandatory union membership. They fought against what they called FDR's socialistic schemes.
Did they have much impact?
They spent a lot of money, but they didn't gain widespread popular traction. They failed pretty badly in trying to oppose FDR in the 1936 election.
Then there were individuals with huge public platforms like Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest.
Yeah, Coughlin was a fascinating and troubling figure. He initially supported FDR and the New Deal.
But then turned against him.
Very sharply. He came to believe the New Deal didn't go far enough, especially in controlling banks and currency. He felt it was actually controlled by powerful international financial interests. He had this massive national radio audience, maybe 40 million listeners at his peak.
Wow.
But the material notes that his rhetoric grew increasingly radical, demagogic, and disturbingly anti-Semitic and pro-fascist over time. Eventually, his superiors in the Catholic Church forced him off the air.
Another magnetic and radical figure was Senator Huey P. Long of Louisiana, known as the Kingfish.
Long was a force of nature, a brilliant populist politician. He proposed a radical Share Our Wealth program.
What did that involve?
He promised to confiscate large fortunes through heavy taxes and guarantee a minimum income and assets. I think the figure was $5,000 for every family, basically making every man a king, as his slogan went.
Sounds appealing to many, I imagine.
Extremely appealing, especially during the Depression. He built an incredibly powerful, almost dictatorial political machine in Louisiana, partly by using state taxes and resources for popular things like building schools, hospitals for the poor, roads, bridges. He basically controlled Louisiana politics from his Senate seat.
A potential rival to FDR.
A serious one. The material suggests he might have challenged FDR for the presidency in 1936, but he was assassinated in the Louisiana State Capitol building in September 1935. His successors lacked his charisma and power.
And then there was Dr. Francis Townsend. He gained a huge following, millions of supporters, with his plan for elderly pensions.
Right. Townsend's plan was simple, though maybe economically unworkable. He proposed giving every person over 60 years old $200 a month.
$200. That was a lot of money then.
A huge sum, about twice the average worker's monthly wage. But there was a catch. They had to send all of it within 30 days.
Why the catch?
The idea was that this mandatory spending by millions of seniors would inject massive purchasing power into the economy and stimulate recovery.
How would it be funded?
Through a national sales tax. Economists at the time estimated the plan would cost something like half the entire national income. So widely seen as impractical, but the sheer popularity of the Townsend movement really highlighted the desperate need for old age security and put pressure on Washington to act.
So the material suggests that the popularity of these critics, Coughlin, Long, Townsend, combined with setbacks like the Supreme Court striking down the NRA and the upcoming 1936 election, all prompted Roosevelt to push for that second New Deal.
Exactly. It was partly a response to the political pressure from the left, partly a reaction to the court's opposition, and partly setting the stage for re-election. This period, sometimes called the Second 100 Days, in the spring and summer of 1935, saw the passage of more fundamental, lasting reforms.
And many of the programs we've already discussed fall into this second New Deal period.
That's right. Things like the Works Progress Administration, WPA, Harry Hopkins' massive work relief program that employed millions on public projects.
Bigger than the PWA.
Much bigger and faster spending than the PWA.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the REA bringing electricity to rural areas, the landmark Wagner Act protecting labor unions, the Social Security Act creating that crucial safety net,
Right.
the Banking Act strengthening the Fed, the Public Utility Holding Company Act regulating utilities, and those changes to the tax code we mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
A really significant burst of reform legislation.
The 1936 election then really solidified the political shifts that were underway. The material highlights the formation of this new coalition within the Democratic Party.
Yes, a coalition that would really dominate American politics for the next few decades.
Who was in this coalition?
It brought together diverse groups that hadn't always voted together. You had, crucially, African Americans who shifted decisively to the Democratic Party in '32 and became a key voting bloc. You had the rapidly growing labor unions, urban voters, and big city political machines, intellectuals, and of course the traditional Democratic base in the Solid South.
Powerful combination.
Very powerful. And the Democratic platform at 36 reflected these new alignments, advocating for expanded farm aid, more labor rights, more public housing and rural electrification, and greater antitrust enforcement, greater control over monopolies.
Who did the Republicans nominate against FDR?
They nominated Alfred Landon, the governor of Kansas. He was a moderate Republican. He criticized the New Deal's cost and argued some parts were unconstitutional. He called for a balanced budget, higher tariffs, lower corporate taxes.
Did he want to repeal the New Deal entirely?
Not exactly. He promised he could administer similar programs more efficiently and less expensively, but didn't propose a wholesale dismantling. There was also a third party, the Union Party, organized by remnants of the Coughlin, Townsend, and Huey Long movements, but their vicious attacks on FDR seemed to backfire.
And the result in 36.
Another overwhelming, historic landslide for Roosevelt. He defeated Landon, carrying all but two states, Maine and Vermont. 523 to 8 electoral votes. Just incredible dominance.
So one of FDR's major confrontations after this decisive victory was with the Supreme Court.
Yes, the court had already struck down key New Deal programs like the NRA and the AAA processing tax. The material notes that the court initially ruled against New Deal measures in 7 out of 9 major cases that came before it in FDR's first term, the 9 old men, as they were sometimes called.
So FDR felt they were blocking his agenda.
He certainly did. He saw this conservative majority, 6 of the 9 justices were over 70 years old, as obstructionists, stuck in the past, and thwarting the will of the people expressed in the elections.
So, to address this, he proposed the Judiciary Reorganization Bill in 1937. What was the plan?
The plan, which became incredibly controversial, would have allowed the president to appoint an additional Supreme Court justice for every sitting justice who was over the age of 70 and hadn't retired.
Up to a maximum.
Up to a maximum of 6 new justices, which would have potentially increased the court size from 9 to 15.
Wow, that sounds bold.
It was immediately seen and widely criticized, even by many Democrats, as an attempt to pack the court with justices favorable to the New Deal, undermining the independence of the judiciary, messing with the constitutional separation of powers.
Accusations of FDR acting like a dictator flew around.
Oh, yes. The criticism was intense. The plan ultimately failed to pass Congress. It was one of FDR's major political defeats.
But then something unexpected happened.
Yes, what's fascinating is the outcome. While the court packing bill itself failed, The Supreme Court itself began to shift its stance on New Deal legislation while the debate was happening.
How so?
Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes and Justice Owen Roberts, who had sometimes sided with the conservatives, started voting with the more liberal justices in several key cases in the spring of 1937. They upheld things like a state minimum wage law for women, the crucial Wagner Act, and the Social Security Act.
The switch in time that saved 9?
Exactly. That's the famous phrase associated with Justice Roberts' shift. Whether the court-packing threat directly caused the shift is debated by historians, but the timing was certainly striking. The court started approving major New Deal reforms.
And did FDR eventually get to change the court's composition anyway?
He did. Despite the failure of the court-packing plan, a wave of retirements and deaths occurred on the court over the next few years. FDR ended up appointing a total of 9 justices to the Supreme Court during his presidency, fundamentally reshaping its outlook for decades to come, more than any president since Washington.
Okay, so the material notes that the New Deal era programs began to kind of wind down towards the end of the 1930s. Why was that?
Several factors. One major event was the recession of 1937-38, sometimes called the Roosevelt recession.
What caused that?
Well, FDR had become increasingly concerned about the growing national debt from all the New Deal spending. He was still, at heart, somewhat fiscally conservative. So, in early 1937, encouraged by some signs of economic recovery, he decided to cut back sharply on government spending, particularly on WPA jobs and other relief programs, in an attempt to move towards a balanced budget. Pull back on the pump priming.
And the result?
The result was a sharp economic downturn. Unemployment jumped back up significantly, wiping out many of the gains made since 1933. It was a major setback and a political embarrassment.
How did they respond to the recession?
In response, FDR reversed course and resumed some deficit spending, particularly on programs like the WPA giving direct aid. This period saw a greater acceptance, or perhaps resignation, towards the economic theories of John Maynard Keynes.
Keynes' idea being?
Keynes's core idea, as explained in the material, was that during a major downturn, the government should actively intervene to stimulate the economy through deficit spending, priming the pump, as the phrase went, even if it meant increasing the national debt in the short term.
Why?
The expectation was that government spending would boost demand, get people working again, and the resulting economic growth would eventually increase tax revenues enough to pay back the debt later on. But it's important to remember, material stresses that these New Deal spending programs were generally viewed at the time as temporary emergency measures, not necessarily permanent fixtures of the economy.
Were there political headwinds too?
Yes. Politically, FDR faced increasing opposition in his second term. The congressional elections of 1938 resulted in significant Democratic losses. They lost about 80 seats in the House.
Ouch.
Yeah, this strengthened a conservative coalition in Congress, made up of Republicans and many Southern Democrats who were wary of further New Deal expansion, especially regarding labor rights and federal power. This coalition could now effectively block most new major reform legislation.
And finally, there was the international situation.
Exactly. The material points to the growing threat of war in Europe and Asia, the clouds of war, which increasingly shifted public attention and government resources and focus away from domestic economic programs towards national defense and foreign policy. World War II was looming.
So, looking back on this incredibly complex era, the material offers a real range of perspectives, doesn't it? Both strong criticisms and equally strong support for the New Deal's impact. It seems crucial to present these different viewpoints fairly.
Absolutely. It was and remains a deeply debated period.
Okay, let's start with the criticisms. A major point often made is that the New Deal didn't actually end the Great Depression.
That's probably the most frequent criticism. Critics argue that while it may have provided relief, it was really the massive government spending and industrial mobilization for World War II that finally restored full employment and robust economic growth in the 1940s. Unemployment was still high in 1939.
Critics also pointed to the huge growth of the federal bureaucracy.
Yes, the alphabet soup of agencies led to a mushrooming federal government. Critics saw the government becoming the largest business in the country, leading to increased centralization of power in Washington, D.C. at the expense of states' rights and local control.
What about the cost?
Huge concerns were raised about the national debt, which roughly doubled during the 1930s from about $19.5 billion in 1932 to over $40 billion by 1939. And there was the worry that America was becoming a handout state, undermining traditional American values of self-reliance, individual initiative, and thrift.
How did business interests often feel?
Business groups often felt the New Deal was fundamentally anti-business, unfairly favoring labor unions and farmers. Some accused FDR of deliberately fomenting class strife between workers and employers. The programs were frequently attacked as representing a dangerous planned economy or creeping socialism, too much government intervention in the free market.
And specific actions drew fire, too.
Definitely. The court packing plan was heavily criticized as an assault on the Constitution's checks and balances. FDR's attempts to purge conservative Democrats who opposed him in the 1938 congressional primary elections were also seen by many as an improper overreach of presidential power.
Other criticisms mentioned.
The material also notes that despite the AAA, farm surpluses continued to be a problem. And as we said, millions remained unemployed even by the late 1930s. So the argument goes, it just didn't solve the fundamental economic problems.
Okay, now let's flip to the support side. What are the main arguments in favor of the New Deal's impact?
Well, the primary achievement, supporters argue, was that it provided crucial relief in the absolute depths of the crisis in 1933. It prevented total economic collapse and widespread starvation. That was its first and most urgent objective.
Establishing a new role for government.
Exactly. It's seen as establishing a fundamental principle that the federal government has a moral responsibility to prevent mass hunger and destitution and to actively manage the economy to some degree to ensure basic stability and security for its citizens.
Did it save capitalism?
That's a major argument. Supporters contend that the New Deal actually kept America's capitalist system from collapsing completely under the weight of the Depression and popular discontent. It achieved a fair distribution of national income, making the system seem more just. And importantly, it enabled millions of citizens to retain their self-respect through work relief programs rather than just handouts.
So FDR as a savior of free enterprise, in a way.
That's the argument. By deflecting popular resentment against business, by addressing the worst abuses of the old system, the material suggests FDR might have actually saved American free enterprise by reforming it, making it more stable and publicly acceptable, purging capitalism of its worst excesses to preserve the core.
And compared to what was happening elsewhere.
That's a key point of support. The New Deal achieved significant reform and provided relief without the kind of violent social upheaval, political extremism, or revolution that plagued many European countries during that same incredibly turbulent period. Reform, not revolution.
So a middle path.
Exactly. Supporters often view FDR's approach, balancing different interests, experimenting, avoiding the radical extremes of either the far left or the conservative right, as a pragmatic middle-of-the-road path. Some argue this made him, perhaps paradoxically, the greatest American conservative since Hamilton, because he preserved the essential system by adapting and reforming it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what we really see is an era defined by just immense crisis and an equally immense, complex, and often contradictory response. The New Deal wasn't a single, neat plan, was it?
Not at all. It was a whole series of experiments driven by pragmatism and necessity that fundamentally reshaped the relationship between Americans and their government, for better or worse, depending on your view.
From those immediate fixes like the bank holiday and the creation of the FDIC, which still protects your money in the bank today, to work programs like the CCC building parks we still enjoy.
To monumental reforms like the TVA transforming an entire region and Social Security establishing a safety net that millions rely on. The scale of intervention was just unlike anything seen before in peacetime America.
The material we explored really shows all these different facets, the personal journey of a leader like FDR, shaped by polio, the harsh economic realities people faced, the innovative, sometimes clashing programs they tried,
the fierce political battles over things like the Supreme Court, and the lasting debates about the New Deal's ultimate effectiveness and legacy, debates that honestly continue today.
It was definitely a time of both desperation and incredible innovation, leaving a truly indelible mark on American society and government.
No doubt about it.
So here's a final thought, building on something the material touched on. It mentioned that many New Deal programs, especially the massive spending and relief efforts, were originally conceived as temporary measures. They were supposed to provide emergency relief and then be wound down as the economy recovered. Yet programs like Social Security, the FDIC, the SEC, farm support's many aspects became permanent fixtures of the American landscape. How does understanding that original intent, that much of it was seen then as temporary and emergency-based, how does that change how you might view the role and purpose of government safety nets and economic regulations today? Are they still emergency measures or something more fundamental, something to think about?